All right, Alexander, let's talk about the long-range missile strikes, the UK's push to get the US's approval to launch Storm Shadow missiles into pre-2014 Russian territory, and Keir Starmer's personal involvement, his personal obsession with getting these Storm Shadow missiles greenlit to be launched into pre-2014 Russian territory. You could talk about his meeting last week with Biden and his staff, and he didn't get the green light, the desired outcome that he was hoping for. Keir Starmer, he's not giving up. We are getting reports that he's now going to go on a tour of Italy, Germany, and France in order to convince those countries to get on board with his plan to attack Russia. I mean, I don't think there's any other words to say what he's trying to attack Russia with Storm Shadow missiles to hit Russia. He's trying to get France, Italy, and Germany on board because these three countries have either said, in the case of France, or they have hinted, in the case of Italy and Germany, that they want nothing to do with long-range missile strikes into pre-2014 Russian territory. So anyway, let's talk about this crazy obsession of the UK government and of Keir Starmer's to attack Russia.
It is an obsession, and it is incredibly dangerous, and it's going to end badly, whatever happens. But let me just first of all say about your comment that this is about Britain launching missile strikes against Russia. Of course, the British government will say it's not about us doing it at all. It's about Ukraine doing it. Ukraine using our missiles to conduct long-range missile strikes against Russia. However, there's been an absolutely, astonishing article in the London Times, very, very revealing article. And it actually contains a phrase in which it says that Britain cannot launch missiles against Russia by itself. It needs American help to do it. And that is, in effect, that's what they're not saying. Ukraine cannot do it. It needs American help as well as British. They're saying Britain cannot do it. Now, all right, you could say that was a slip or something like that. But, sometimes slips happen, which are very suggestive. This article was clearly based on very high level briefings, including from people within the British Defence Ministry. And I have to say, this is clearly what we're looking at. Now, you're absolutely right. This is a complete obsession. It's developing into something of a personal crusade. You would have thought that what happened to Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, all of them embraced Zelensky, would play out, would warn Keir Starmer not to follow in those tracks. You would have thought that the advice of the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, which is basically to dial down and back off. The same article in the Times says that the Foreign Office advised Starmer that Britain is going too far ahead on this, that they're out on a limb on this one, that they need to get back into the pack. They shouldn't really be going out and lobbying all by themselves for this sort of thing. And that
what's the Foreign Office's connection? Is that connected to the Foreign Ministry? Or
the Foreign Office is the Foreign Ministry.
With the Foreign Office.
The Foreign Office is the Foreign Ministry. Yeah. So we don't have a Foreign Minister. We have a Secretary of State, and the Foreign Office is our Foreign Ministry. We have all these antique Victorian names for many of our departments. Just saying. But anyway, the Foreign Ministry, let's call it the Foreign Ministry, is advising the government, is advising Starmer not to do this. And Starmer, we read in the article, the same article in the Times, faced the Foreign Ministry down. In other words, he rejected their advice. We've had the former National Security Advisor and former ambassador to Washington, Lord Darroch. He's coming along. He's also giving interviews to the Financial Times. He's saying this is an incredibly bad idea. We don't want to do this. It could get us into all sorts of trouble. But he's ploughing on. He's determined to press forward with this idea. And the article of the Times told us a lot of other things. They told us that he'd been encouraged to take this course by Tony Blinken. This is exactly what we said in various programs, that Tony Blinken and the neocons in the US are keen on this idea also. So he's basically listening to what Tony Blinken said. He assumed that because Tony Blinken told him, well, the people in Washington are coming round to your point of view, he assumed that this was true. So he came along to Washington expecting that Biden and the other American officials that he met would say yes. And he got a shock when instead they said no. They said, we're not doing it now. This is simply not an option for the moment. And they're turning around and they're blaming Jake Sullivan. They say Jake Sullivan was the person who really doesn't believe in any of this, and he's somehow exercising the sinister influence over the president and over the entire US government. And it is he and only he who apparently is preventing this brilliant thing, these attacks with these missiles being done. And in the meantime, we see that the Europeans are very, very cool on this idea. Olaf Scholz has ruled it out. He's come out, made an absolutely clear statement. He says this isn't going to happen. He's not going to supply Taurus missiles to Ukraine. He's not going to authorize long-range missile strikes against Russia. Against Russia. Meloni is saying exactly the same. Now, a few weeks ago in France, Macron might also have backed this idea. And bear in mind, the Storm Shadow is basically a French missile. Apparently, it's a derivative of a missile that the French developed in the 1980s. They are the people who produce it. There's been some British input, but it's the French who provide it, and the French have to give permission for it to be used in this way. And it's absolutely clear after the recent parliamentary elections in France that the French public is opposed to it, that most of the French political class now on the left and on the right oppose it as well. I suspect that Michel Barnier, Macron's designate as prime minister, given his background, will probably want to oppose it as well. So the French not keen on this idea either. But Starmer is obsessed and wants to do it. Now, ultimately, the people who matter are the Americans. If the Americans change their position, then it will happen. But if the Americans stick to saying no, then it won't and it can't. And this is the last incredible revelation that the Times gave, which it talked about the Storm Shadow. And it said that because the Russians are jamming all the GPS signals, the only way that the Storm Shadow can penetrate Russian defenses is through using ground mapping technology, that this depends on American satellites. And but they don't quite say that it has to be uploaded. The data has to be uploaded by American technicians. But it does say that this is an American proprietary system. And of course, that takes us straight back to what Vladimir Putin said a couple of days ago in the warning he gave. He said that Ukraine cannot launch these Storm Shadows by itself. It needs NATO personnel to format the missiles in order for that to happen. Now, that warning, those words of Putin, have not been widely publicized in the West. In fact, in Britain, they haven't been publicized at all. But we see that the Times, in effect, is confirming their truth, that the Americans have to be involved. They have to provide the satellite data, and probably they have to provide the formatting as well. And that, I think, takes us directly to what this is all about. It is about getting the United States directly involved in the war, because the British know that Ukraine is losing the war. They know that the situation in Ukraine is becoming desperate. The British are massively overinvested in Project Ukraine. So the only way to turn things round is to somehow find some means to pull in the United States. And how are they going to do it? They're going to do it by getting these Storm Shadow missiles launched against Russia. And I think the Americans have figured it out, or at least some of them have, which is why they're resisting. And I think that in Starmer's case, as you rightly say, it's become also something of a personal crusade.
Well, Americans like Blinken
They want
the
it.
U.S. to jump into
They
this
want
conflict.
it. They want it, absolutely.
The Pentagon would go for it too if they thought they could come out with a win. But the Pentagon obviously now understands. Finally, the Pentagon understands that they've lost this,
Yes.
and that this would really endanger the U.S. military if they did something like this.
Correct.
Finally, they've realized exactly what's at stake here, and so they're putting a brake on all of this. The defense ministers, speaking of the Pentagon in the United States, the defense ministry in the UK, unfortunately, according to the Sunday Times, they're egging Starmer on.
Yes.
The Sunday Times reported that Wallace, Grant Shapps, 3 or 4 other defense ministers, and Boris Johnson are telling Starmer to go it alone. Just
Absolutely.
forget the U.S.
Absolutely.
Launch the missiles.
Yes, which of course you can't. I mean, that's what the Times tells us. You need an American input to do it. But the defense ministry, or at least some people in the defense and security world, and I don't think it is limited to just these ministers, by the way, these ex-ministers, they are obviously actively lobbying for this thing. And again, it's not difficult to understand why. Britain has massively overinvested in Project Ukraine. It's gone far out on a limb. If Project Ukraine fails, if Ukraine is defeated, it is a defeat for Britain. And that is something that they find unendurable, especially as it would be a defeat of Britain by the Russians, who, as we know, the British have some kind of massive problem with.
Yeah. So the whole goal is to pull the U.S. into the conflict. Americans, hopefully they understand this. American people, hopefully they understand what's happening. Zelensky's victory plan is effectively to pull the U.S. into the conflict. There is no NATO. The U.S. is NATO. And so the whole goal is just to get the U.S. into the conflict in Ukraine. Who even knows? Maybe even with boots on the ground, God knows what they're thinking. But they have to get the U.S. into the war. That's their only possible, and it doesn't even guarantee a victory, it's their only possible chance of perhaps pulling off some sort of a stalemate or some sort of a victory. If they don't get the U.S. into the war, it's done. Everyone understands this, including Jake Sullivan. I believe that Jake Sullivan has finally understood that this thing is over. And the Pentagon has understood that this thing is over. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't want to keep this thing going until after the elections. As we've said in many videos, for them, it benefits them if they can just keep this thing going until January or February when they're long gone. But the conflict, in effect, is lost. The Netherlands is saying that they don't have Patriot missiles to give to Ukraine, even though they were talking about providing Patriot air defense systems to Ukraine. There are no Patriot air defense systems to give to Ukraine. The money's running out. There are various U.S. publications which are saying that even if Harris were to win in 24 November, there's just no more money to give to Ukraine. So, I mean, this is what's happening. But you still have these defense ministers, these Boris Johnsons traveling to Kiev, Blinken. They're still trying to get the U.S. into some sort of a showdown with Russia.
You're absolutely right. That is exactly what is happening. And it's not so different from what Macron was trying to do, if you remember, a few months ago. Right after the fall of Avdiivka, we had the previous big panic. Ukraine looked like it was going to lose. Macron goes out. He talks about sending French troops to Ukraine to hold the line there. We said at the time, others started to say it also, that what Macron was really doing was he was trying to create a situation where the French came up against the Russians, and the French would then ask the Americans to come and save them. That was basically what that was all about. French society was deeply hostile to that whole plan. And after, as we know, the parliamentary elections followed. First, there was the European elections and then the parliamentary elections. And it became clear that French society was dead against that whole idea. So now the British are trying to do the same thing. Again, they understand that British society would never agree to British troops being sent to fight in Ukraine, openly fight in Ukraine. Covertly, they are, of course, there, and they have been there all along. You remember we did a live stream with Jim Webb in which he talked about how the SAS was fighting the Russians at Gostomel Airport in February and March 2022. Just saying. But the British, maybe they're covertly, the British people will accept that, but they will never accept a situation where the British Army, such as it is, not in any great shape, goes and fights the Russians. So instead, what they're trying to do is they're trying to use the storm shadows and this idea of long-range strikes against Russia to drag in the United States. It's exactly the same story as we saw with Macron. As you rightly said, the Americans, some Americans are opposed, some Americans are in favor. Tony Blinken wants to enlarge the war. I'm pretty sure that there are others in the State Department who are also keen on doing this. But the Pentagon is opposed because they don't want to get into a war with the Russians because they understand how dangerous that would be. And they don't want to get themselves anyway in any kind of situation where the Russians might want to or choose to retaliate against American assets around the world. And Jake Sullivan, who's the National Security Advisor, and who therefore has to listen every day to what the Pentagon is telling him. He has clearly called on this idea. He wants, as you correctly say, to keep the war going until the election and beyond. But he no longer, I'm sure, believes in a Ukrainian victory anymore. And if you want confirmation of that, go to the London Times article again, because you have an ex-British official talking about Jake Sullivan, saying, he doesn't believe. It's actually there. He doesn't really believe in the possibility of a Ukrainian victory. And, this terrible man, Jake Sullivan, he never really believed in it anyway. Going all the way back to February 2022, he was the one who was always the problem. I mean, it's a really nasty set of things that they're saying about Jake Sullivan. I can't believe, by the way, I was going to put him in a sympathetic mood towards the British, but that's another story. But you can see that when you say that Jake Sullivan doesn't believe in a Ukrainian victory, the British agree with you.
Two final questions. The first question I have is what would happen if the UK just stopped supporting Project Ukraine? I mean, to the everyday citizen of Britain, of the UK, what's the big deal? Why is this so existential?
It would be a huge relief to them. I mean, it would be.
It's a serious question. Yes, why is this so existential? For the British. I mean, just let it go.
Absolutely. Back in February, March, April 2022, you couldn't move around Britain without seeing Ukrainian flags outside houses, and people were putting pro-Ukrainian stickers in their windows and all of that. All of that's disappeared. The British public has a lot more to think about and worry about than Ukraine. I also think, if anything, they've probably not just become less supportive of Ukraine, but I think criticism and skepticism about the whole thing has actually grown. And as you rightly say, Britain has many, many problems that it needs to deal with. And Ukraine is not just a distraction from those problems, but as we've discussed in many programs, this commitment to Ukraine is making the problems worse. It's causing energy prices, energy costs to rise. It's led to vast expenditures of money. it's led to a critical situation with the British defence system. And of course, there's been claims, which I don't know whether they're true. I want to say that. But there's also claims that it's left British banks exposed because supposedly they're given guarantees for Ukrainian loans. I want to stress again, I've heard that. I've never seen any report about it here in Britain. But most people in Britain, I think, would frankly say, well, maybe we're a bit sorry that Ukraine's gone down, but ultimately we've got more important things to worry about. The political class is different. The political class, the security establishment, the defence establishment, the people in Westminster, the people in the two major parties are different because they've made the duel that they believe they are conducting with Russia the central element in their claim that Britain is still a world power. They by matching off against Russia as they see it, they can tell the Americans, look, we're still important. They can tell the world, look, we're still important. You see, the Russians are big and powerful and strong, and the fact that we're dueling with them must also mean that we too are big, powerful and strong. If Ukraine goes down, if Britain loses, Britain by extension loses, then that whole narrative, which is psychologically very important to a British political class, which still hankers after great power status. It's not so long ago since Britain was a great power and had its empire and all of that. Anyway, once that goes, they are left accepting the fact that they are reduced to leading a diminished country as they would see it on the margin of world affairs. And that is something that they simply can't bring themselves to accept. Now, as I said, I actually think, on the contrary, it'll be a liberating moment if they stop dreaming these fantasies of, great British power and all of that. They might actually start looking at Britain itself, understanding that there's an awful lot that can be done here, that it'd be exciting and interesting to start doing it and to start addressing real British problems. But the British political class won't accept that. I remember reading a British commentator not so long ago in the Telegraph, talking about how if Russia wins, it will be a humiliation for the two most powerful countries in NATO, which are the United States and Britain, bracketing Britain, giving it some kind of equal status to the United States, which is a nonsensical idea. It's an absurd one, but it's where many of them still, the thing that they still cling to.
Yeah. Final question, a little bit on a lighter note. What's up with Boris Johnson? What's his angle in what he's doing? Is his goal to become another Tony Blair type of figure where he's just traveling the world, getting paid ungodly amounts of money to cause trouble and chaos? Because he pops up in Kiev a couple of days ago, and no one is quite understanding what his role is in the British government, in the globalist elite architecture. What is Boris Johnson's angle? What's up with this guy?
Well, I think you've answered the question, and you've answered the question as you posed the question. I mean, the reason Boris is doing this is because he wants to keep himself noticed. So Ukraine was his big thing. So he just plugs on with that big thing. That makes him look and sound important. He's able to travel to Kiev, make out that he's this still this world statesman of some kind. That means that he can also get invitations to all the various conferences and places and speak there about, the danger from Russia. Reciting again and again and again his own versions of Winston Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech from the 1940s. Remember, he actually has written a biography of Churchill, by the way. Not a very good one, in my opinion, but that's my view. Anyway, so, that's what he's doing. He's keeping himself noticed. He's keeping himself, he's preserving the fiction that he's still someone important. And of course, it materially speaking, it's good for him because he gets paid for doing what he does. I'm not saying that at some level he doesn't also believe in all of this. I'm sure he does at some level. But with Boris, always the material benefits matter. And I'm sure that they play a large role in making him do what he does. He will never acquire the influence over British politics that Tony Blair has. I say that with regret because I think Tony Blair's influence is disastrous, by the way, just to say. Boris's influence would be equally disastrous if it were ever to expand to those levels. But Blair is a much more how shall I put it? Well, in some ways, intelligent and manipulative and dangerous figure than Johnson will ever be.
Yeah, true. All right. We will end the video there. TheDuran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, Rockfin, and Twitter X. And go to the Duran shop, pick up some merch, like the t-shirts that we are wearing today in this video. The link is in the description box down below. Take care.